Welcome to the M1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we've got an amazing episode for you guys. We've got Bill von Hippel on the show. Bill is an evolutionary psychologist, and I originally came across his work on Joe Rogan. He's also been on some other big podcasts like London Real. Super smart guy. We delve into a whole bunch of really, really interesting topics, in my opinion. And I think this episode is going to be really useful for you guys as far as understanding our foundational evolutionary tendencies and how to work with them as opposed to against them. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Let's delve right in. Bill, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for joining me.
Delighted to be here, Marcus.
So I'm curious, how did you get into the whole evolutionary psychology game to begin with? What interested you originally?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's a lot of people think that it's sort of tangential to the work of a psychologist, and I thought it was important but not central for the longest time. But eventually I decided that it was really central to understand people because as I kept looking at the way humans are today, I'm a psychologist and I just study human interaction, we would always end up with, our theories would always be something like, well, that's what makes people happy, that's why they do it. Or that's what makes people feel a positive sense of self-esteem, that's why they do it. But our theories never answer the question, well, why does that make you happy? Or why does that increase your self-esteem? And so I started to realize more and more I needed to go back in time and try to get a better sense of where we came from and the evolutionary pressures on us over time in order to understand why our motivations are the way they are today.
Gotcha. So correct me if I'm wrong, but Earth seems to be about 4 billion years old, more or less. But how long have we been evolving for, and when did things really kick off for us humans?
That's a great question, too. So, look, we have confidence intervals around all of these answers, right? We don't know exactly, and sometimes one way of answering the question gives us a slightly different date than other ways. So we can date fossils, we can use molecular clocks inside our DNA, and those tend to give us an answer that's similar, but also has confidence intervals around it. So with that sort of typical academic caveat, humans have, the way we are today, physiologically, have been around for 200,000 to 300,000 years. And it's been about 6 to 7 million years since we separated from our chimpanzee cousins. So over the last 6 to 7 million years, we've been sort of, in fits and starts, moving away from what chimpanzees look like today toward what humans look like today. And basically, if you ran into somebody, the earliest Homo sapiens 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, they would look a tiny bit different from you and me, but you would have no question immediately identifying them as human.
Gotcha. Okay, so you said that we evolved essentially from chimpanzees. So your book, The Social Leap, goes into some of this stuff. It's fascinating. So how exactly did that transition happen from, say, going from the trees down to land and going across the savannah and all that good stuff?
Yeah, sure. So the 6 or so million years ago, the Great African Rift Valley had been basically forming at that point, for about the last 25 million years. And so what that is this great big sort of tectonic zipper that runs from the Red Sea in the north down to the coast of Mozambique in the south. And what's happening is that Africa is actually tearing into two pieces. And this is due to tectonic activity, much the same way that, at one time, all the Earth's continents were one landmass, and then they separated and some of them smashed into each other again. What's happening in Africa right now is it's tearing apart with this sort of Somali plate moving to the lower right and the rest moving to the upper left. The consequence of that is all this tectonic activity in the Great African Rift Valley and then increasing elevation on the land on the right-hand side on the east. And that increasing elevation in Somalia, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and Ethiopia, basically over the last 30 million years has been drying out the rainforest as each piece of land slowly gets elevated. The end result is that by 6 million years ago, essentially there were only small patches of rainforest left and not enough to maintain our sort of chimp-like ancestors who were living still in the trees at that time. And so essentially they were just forced out of the trees by the trees drying out and disappearing and that land being replaced by savanna. If we look at the few chimpanzees who live in savanna today, we can see the kinds of ways that they lived, and it works. And it's acceptable, but it's really about skulking around the margins and no longer being the dominant predator that they were in the treetops. So it was really a massive change for our chimp ancestors, and how they adapted to that change is sort of a lucky chance-filled story that ends up with us.
Yeah, so if we could delve into that story a little bit, that would be great, because, I mean, the risk of coming out of the trees and venturing across the savannah would have been massive, but obviously the pressure to do so would have had to been just slightly more or a lot more in order for us to decide to do so, or the chimpanzees to do so. So how did that sort of play out?
Yeah, that's a great point. So on the one hand, chimps don't want to leave the trees because they're at risk when they do. In the trees, especially when they're in groups, nobody predates chimpanzees, not even leopards who quite like to eat chimpanzees will try to attack them when they're in their groups in a tree because they're simply too fast and too dangerous. But when they're on the ground, they're slow, not compared to us, but compared to the big predators, and therefore they're susceptible to leopard predation, but they're also susceptible to animals that they don't even interact with in the forest, like lions, like hyenas, and at that time, even saber-toothed cats. So it was, a very dicey business to cross the savannah if you're a animal that's used to living in the trees. And what would force you out? Well, as the trees start to disappear more and more, they have less and less food available to them in the small stand of trees that they're still stuck in. So in the end, they kind of have a choice: starve to death in these very small bit of trees that we still have left, or venture down onto the ground and look for food elsewhere, look for foods even that they're not used to eating. And so, as you point out, it was an enormous pressure, basically starvation, that pushed them out of the trees. And then if we look at how chimps do it today, when the chimps in Senegal, some of them live in the savannah, they basically skulk around the edges. They stay really close to the trees. They always have an eye over their shoulder. They live in slightly larger groups to try to keep more eyes out for predators. And so basically they're in a constant state of fear rather than being in a constant state of, this is my territory, things are good with me, I can throw my weight around however I'd like. And so that basically progressed for, essentially that story seems to have been the case for the next 3 million years until we get to Australopithecines. And by the time we get to them, we now see an animal that's bipedal, by which I mean it walks on two legs and it can stand fully upright. Our chimpanzees, chimp-like ancestors and our current chimp cousins, they have their knees can't lock, their hips can't go fully straight, and so they can't really stand upright. But by 3 million years, you now get to an animal that can stand upright, and as a consequence, its sort of body is stretched out a little bit, and its body has become a little bit more lateral in the way it deals with the environment. Rather than going up and down trees all the time, so with vertical musculature, it's dealing with the world next to it. And so it's got more side-to-side muscles. And those changes in our body type were really just changes to adapt to living on the ground. But those changes then led to what's the single most important invention in military history, which is the capacity to kill at a distance. And so once Australopithecines had this more lateral body, that's where the muscles are side to side, they're in a much better position to throw. And throwing now changes everything, because if an animal attacks you, like imagine that you're attacked by a large animal like a lion, or you decide you want to attack it. Well, probably you and I and 100 of our closest friends could easily kill it with stones if we just jumped on it and bashed it to death, but it'd be a guarantee that whoever got there first is going to die, whoever got there second is going to die, third, fourth, and fifth are probably going to die, and probably only by the sixth person, when the lion's mouth is pretty full, do we have a decent chance of surviving this attack. But if you can throw rocks at it, if you can pelt it from a distance, suddenly lots of animals can attack it with safety from a great distance. And so Australopithecines seem to be the first of our ancestors who developed this capacity, and that completely changed everything about how they lived their life. It completely changed everything about what their position was going to be on the savannah. And that's the story that eventually led to us.
That was a beautiful explanation. So your theory around being able to throw and kill at a distance, and with combination with sort of Yuval Noah Harari's theory of being able to work in large groups, how does that sort of lethal combination elevate us to essentially the top of the food chain? Because on our own, we're pretty weak and slow animals, but in these larger groups, we seem to be able to achieve a lot more.
No, that's exactly right. And so it was this early pressure on Australopithecines that probably created what Harari talks about when he talks about our capacity to work in large groups. So if you look at chimpanzees, they don't like to cooperate with each other. They like to work alone. They will hunt together on occasion because They can surround monkeys and they have a slightly better chance, for example, in hunts like that. But as a rule, if you look at them in the laboratory or in the wild, you see their preferences to work alone and that they're fundamentally competitive with each other. If you look at humans, we're fundamentally cooperative with each other. We, of course, can be quite competitive, but our orientation is toward cooperation. And what we think happened is around the time of Australopithecines, when they developed this capacity to kill at a distance, suddenly there was enormous pressure on them that they could benefit by cooperating. So prior to their ability to throw, when attacked by a leopard or a lion or a hyena or whatever, their best chance is just scatter. Everybody run for the trees. Now, if they do that, given that they're slower than their predators, they know someone's going to die, but probably whoever it is, hopefully won't be me kind of thing, right? So they have a decent chance if they just run of surviving it. If they try to attack the predator, well, lots of them are going to die, so that's not a good deal. In contrast, once they develop the capacity to throw, now if one of them throws, well, still that's not a good thing, because one Australopithecine throwing stones is going to basically end up in the stomach of a slightly annoyed leopard or lion. But if they could cooperate and all throw together, suddenly they've got this emergent property of the group, which is that now no one's going to die because they can literally drive away almost any predator that's out there. So it suddenly becomes in everyone's best interest to cooperate and not to head for the trees as fast as they can. And so I don't know how long it took for that realization to dawn on them. I don't know how long it took for their minds to evolve in a way that cooperation became more natural for them. It could have taken 1 million tries, right? We don't have, unfortunately, any clear data of what happened behaviorally. But somewhere along that time, they would have realized, boy, when we all work together and we cooperate and we throw, we're much safer. And those animals who happen to have that predilection would have survived this process more readily. And that's exactly when we see our brain size start to take off. And so the idea here is that as we gain the capacity to throw, and therefore we gain some benefit by cooperating beyond what we already had in cooperating in small ways, we gain some massive benefit. That would have oriented us much more toward each other, made us much more interdependent with our groups, and that interdependence now gave us greater advantage if we got smarter, because now we could start developing, for example, division of labor. We could start planning for the future. We could start doing all sorts of things that led us back to where we are today, being back at the top of the food chain. And you don't see any of those early capacities in Australopithecines, but by the time you get to Homo erectus, which is our ancestor that first appeared about 2 million years ago in Africa, and actually it doesn't look exactly like us, but it starts to look much, much more like a human. Now you can see that they could plan for the future. They had division of labor. We can see that kind of thing in the fossil evidence. And so by that point, you got into an animal that was probably, or that the data seemed to suggest was fundamentally much more cooperative. And of course, their brains were growing massively by that point in time. And then eventually that leads to us.
So how does the evolution of language fit into all of that? Because as far as people cooperating in big groups, you'd imagine that they'd need some sort of way to communicate. So how do you think that language fits into that story?
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, we don't have a clear answer. We do believe that their communicative abilities would have steadily improved as they got smarter. And so if you look at the chimpanzee, it has about a 380-gram brain. And they can communicate a few things. You get to Australopithecines 3 million years later, we're only at a 450-gram brain, so they probably could communicate a tiny bit better. By the time you get to Homo erectus, you're now looking at a 960-gram brain, and so there's much greater capacity to communicate. But what we don't know is how that communication was conducted. In all probability, it was largely sign language, but it's also possible that they're starting to get voluntary control of the voice box and starting to supplement that with different complex sounds and maybe even grammar. It's not until we get to humans that we obviously have clear evidence that we have the kind of enormously complex communicative structure that we have in place, and that allows us to do things like you mentioned, cooperating in very large groups. But remember, our ancestors never had any desire or need to coordinate very large groups because they lived in such small groups. It's not until agriculture 10,000 years ago, and then the first cities at 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, that you see large groups getting together and the need to cooperate beyond the sort of very small groups of 20 to 50 to maybe as high as 75 members of your group that we would have lived in the past. And so our communicative abilities that we now have enable us to live in the extraordinary large groups that we now have, but that's very modern.
Gotcha. So Evolving in groups obviously has advantages and disadvantages, one being more mating options, but then the instant drawback of that is more competition. So I'm super fascinated by how we began to show signs of quality, or essentially separating ourselves and being more desirable so we can pass on our genes versus somebody standing next to us passing on theirs.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got these competing qualities, right? You've got to worry about the bigger your group, the more dangerous you are, the better you can protect your group is against other groups or against predators. So that's a big advantage. And there's also a lot more mating opportunities, but there's also a lot more competition for those mating opportunities. And the one thing that makes that work out really well in the case of humans is that there's lots of ways for us to skin that particular cat. And so if you look at lots of other animals, there's really only one way to get a mate. For example, if you're a dung beetle, you have to be able to roll a really large ball of dung so that you have something for the infant, the babies, the eggs that are laid to eat. They eat this dung, and that's what's going to attract a female to you. If you can't roll a large ball of dung, well, you're out of business. But if you're a human, there's lots of ways that you can attract a mate. You could be the best storyteller in your group, and so you have value to your group by passing on knowledge and entertaining people. You could be the strongest in your group. You could be the best hunter in your group. You could be the kindest and the most generous, and so people know they can count on you. And so the enormously complex ways that we live, being much more complicated than a dung beetle, with many different ways of making a living and many different ways of working within our group, allow us to have lots of different ways to be of value to the group. Now, that still means that the competition is there, but at least it means that, a little guy like me can say, well, all right, I'm never going to be the toughest in my group. Let me find another way to be valuable. And I think that's what all of us do. We try to find the ways that we're different from everybody else, but in a positive way, because that allows us to contribute some value to our group, which in our ancestral environment was critical if we were going to survive and mate.
Gotcha. So are there some primary differences between males and females when it comes to signifying quality, or are they sort of the same across the board? How does that play out?
Well, lots of the ways are the same. And so both men and women are looking for somebody who's kind, somebody who's honest, somebody who is cooperative, somebody who's intelligent, all those things, somebody who's physically fit. That matters to men and women. But of course, there's also important differences between men and women and the challenges that they face. And those differences can lead to differences in what we look for. So for a female to be fertile is very difficult. She has to be able to make a larger sex cell than males make. An egg is much bigger than a sperm. But much more importantly than that, she then has to be able to carry it. She has to gestate, so carry it to term for 9 months. And then she has to be able to lactate. And in our ancestral environment, that was typically for about 2 years. So for a woman to do that, she has to be young and fit and strong. And so what men tend to look for in a mate are signs of what we regard as physical attractiveness as humans. We've evolved to regard these as signs of attractiveness to women because what they do is they correlate with fertility, like youthfulness, like hourglass shape, things like that show that a female is fertile and can reproduce. Now, fertility is so easy for males that women are less concerned about that. But they have other concerns. They would like a male who is strong and can protect them because we have sexual dimorphism, in part protecting them from other males. But they would also like a male who is ambitious and can gather resources because it's so hard for them to raise their offspring. They want a guy who's likely to be able to help. And to be able to help, he needs to, in our modern world, earn money and things like that. But in the ancestral world, it was the same. Ambitious, be a good hunter, etc. And then he also needs to be generous with those things when he returns home with them. And so women tend to be more oriented to resources and ambition and signs that he'll share them with her. And men tend to be more oriented toward her physical attractiveness.
We all have a certain amount of complacency in us, but we all have drive in us to different degrees as well. But it seems that neither complacency or drive equate to feeling content or happiness. So why do we have both? And then how can we sort of realistically tote that line?
Yeah, look, it's hard, right? So on the one hand, people are ambitious and they have some project in mind. It could be work, it could be social, it could be just at home in the yard kind of thing that they really want to achieve. And on the other hand, we have this desire to be sort of lazy and take life easy and relax and socialize. And so we evolved a motivational system that drives us to achieve more, but that's a really kind of dirty trick, if you ask me. And what that motivational system does is it drives us to achieve. It makes us feel happy if we achieve, but it forgets to tell us that happiness won't last. But nonetheless, it's super important that happiness won't last, because otherwise, if you could be permanently happy based on one achievement, well, then you'd never be motivated to achieve again, and everybody else in your group would pass you by. And therefore, you would end up with the lowest status in your group, and you'd never successfully mate. So in order to make sure that we remain high in status, we have this motivation to achieve, that when we succeed in whatever our endeavor is, it does make us happy. It depends, if the success is big enough, it can make us incredibly happy. But then that happiness is designed to slowly fade. We evolve for that not to last, so that over time, our motivation to achieve will reemerge, and we won't be left behind by the other members of our group, but we'll get out there, killing more saber-toothed tigers or mammoths, mastodons, or in our modern world, trying to get another promotion, trying to do a better investment, trying to build a better home, whatever the case might be.
Yeah, it's interesting because that new normal sort of normalizes very quickly, and you buy that new car, that wears off pretty quick. I see it with weight loss all the time. People lose weight, they're super stoked, and then afterwards that becomes sort of the new normal, and it's just a regular thing, and then it's very easy to slip back into old patterns and habits. So it's a tricky one.
It's a very tricky one. And the problem is that we tell ourselves, if I could only lose 20 pounds, or if I could only get that promotion, if I could only get her to go out with me, I will be happy forever. And the reality is you won't. You will be happier, and depending on how big the achievement is, it will last for a while. But as you point out, we quickly adapt to that new presence. Now, on the positive side, we also adapt to things getting worse. I mean, think about this COVID world that we live in. Somebody told you, oh yeah, you're not going to be able to leave your house for a long time, and you won't be able to do all these fun things you were doing. You'd say, oh, I'm going to be permanently unhappier. But if you look inside yourself, I don't think most of us are permanently unhappier. We've adapted to the sort of living in our own little zoos, and we're probably about as happy as we were before. So we can, in the same way that things that make us happy don't last, it's also, fortunately, the case that things that make us unhappy don't last, because we adapt to that new normal and we start to look up from it or down from it. So in the same way, I guess the analogy for me is you get in a hot tub, and when you first get in, it's like, oh, this is too hot, I can't bear this. But as you slowly sink into it, you're like, oh, this is comfy. And after a while, it doesn't even necessarily feel hot at all. And that's essentially the way happiness and all these other emotions work as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It obviously works both ways. So I'd love to get into your 5 keys to happiness. So the first one is community. What sort of role does community and playing our part in community contribute to our happiness?
So our ancestors were unsafe if they were ever outside of their community. If they were wandering alone across the savannah, they were highly likely to become dinner. Remember, one person throwing isn't going to protect himself. And that even holds in a much more modern world. Imagine that you were dropped alone in the forest by yourself. You'd be sad, scared, and probably someone's dinner pretty soon. But if you were dropped in the forest with 20 people, you guys would make plans, you'd make traps, you'd eventually be fine. And so we just did not evolve to want to be alone. In fact, we evolved very strongly to want to be with others. And we don't want to be with just random others. In an ideal world, we want to be with others that we know well, and so therefore we can predict their behavior, and who know us well, and therefore accept us as we are. And for almost all of us, what that means is community. And so the community that you grew up in is typically that, but of course we often move into new jobs and new places. And what makes those situations work if we can find new communities to embed ourselves in. Now, sometimes they'll be work-based, sometimes they'll be hobbies or whatever, but the key is, A, find a community that makes you happy, and B, if you physically have to leave your community behind, trying to retain those contacts as much as possible so that you can retain that feeling of connection. When people lose that's one of the most fundamental things. It's super hard to stay happy.
Do you think the classic introvert, extrovert labels are malleable, or do you think those are somewhat fixed?
Well, the data suggests that they're about 50% inherited. So your tendency to be extroverted or introverted, in fact, is a little bit stronger than that. On average, things are about 50, but extroversion is a bit higher. So those And those tendencies are strong, but they're also, what they really are fundamentally about is how much do you like to be around lots of people you don't know well. And introverts tend to prefer to be with smaller numbers of people and people they know better. Extroverts tend to prefer to be with larger numbers of people and they're quite content with people they don't know well, although that's not necessary. But they find, going to a party and meeting new people is something that seems exciting to an extrovert and seems daunting to an introvert. But both of them have a strong need for community. And so an introvert often has times that they want to be by themselves, but it's an incredibly rare person who wants to be alone all the time. It's happened, because there's always people way out on the ends of the tails. But most introverts are most comfortable when they have some alone time, but also quite a bit of time with people who matter to them. It may only be a few, but nonetheless people who matter a lot to them, their sense of community.
Yeah, that makes sense because I've hung out with people that are more the merrier kind of people when you're out and about in groups. I'm like that. I'd love to be inclusive and stuff like that. And then I've also hung out with people that say go out with a group of 4 people and only want to talk to those 4 people and keep it within that group. So would that class of example of an introvert versus an extrovert?
Yeah, definitely. So if having other people join your group at the bar or the party or whatever is kind of a bummer, rather than, oh, that sounds like fun, that's a sign that you're more introverted. Now, of course, it depends on the group you're with. If you're just getting back together with your old mates from college and you haven't seen them in years, you don't want randoms joining you. And so that's not really an extroverted, introverted thing. And then the other side of that coin is as we get older, we tend to get more focused on the people who really matter and less focused on people who we might be perfectly friendly with but aren't as close to us. And so that's a general life pattern that happens. But in the context of going out at any one time, the more you just want to be with your small group of friends is a sign you're introverted. The more you would love to meet new people is a sign you're extroverted.
Gotcha. Okay, so we also have this sort of inherent need to be liked and approved of. Is that a result of evolving in these larger groups and you being so dependent on your other group members for survival, do you think? Like, where does that come from?
Yeah, that's exactly where it comes from. And so if people in my group don't like me, then I'm at real risk of being tossed out. The day I fail to come home with any giraffe that I've hunted and they already don't like me, they're going to be like, well, Bill, we've had it with you. See you later. Or I'll wake up in the morning and literally they're all gone. And so being ostracized is a death sentence for our ancestors. And that's why when people reject us today, it hurts so much. It seems to be physically painful when we're rejected because our ancestors who didn't mind being rejected, well, they're not our ancestors. They wandered off alone and then they got eaten. And so only those potential ancestors who were likable and who cared about being likable were the ones who the group kept around. And if the group isn't going to keep you around, you're not going to make it. So everything about our psychology has evolved with regard to that gregariousness, the fundamental importance of our groups. And the need to be liked is a really good example of that.
Yeah, I think this is going to be so helpful for folks because it's actually wired into us versus, somebody thinking that they inherently need somebody's approval for some deficit that they have as a person or whatever.
Yeah, it's definitely not a deficit as a person. We all need that. And the only difference between people who are secure and people who are insecure is the secure folks are confident they have it and the insecure folks are not. And so you can turn anyone into an insecure person if they start to get very conditional feedback about whether people like them and if they start to notice that they can't control whether they're being positively evaluated. So it's, feeling psychologically secure is super important, but where it fundamentally comes from is confidence that others around you like you and value you. Because if our ancestors didn't feel that way, well, it was important that they should feel bad. It was important that they should feel motivated to try to get others to like them, because otherwise they're at risk of getting tossed out. Evolution doesn't care about how you feel, except for the degree to which those feelings facilitate your survival and reproduction. And so if you're oblivious to people not liking you, well, evolution's going to be selecting against you.
So would that sort of be the origin of certain emotions, like, for example, embarrassment and shame? So it would actually keep you from, being ostracized from a group because you behave in a certain way that is in accordance with that group?
That's exactly right. So emotions like embarrassment and shame, we call them self-conscious emotions because they're emotions where you're reflecting on how others are evaluating the self. You're conscious of your position. Other animals can't really do that. And so if I want to do something, I can simulate in my mind how it's going to come out. And then I say, ooh, that's going to be really embarrassing. So I say to myself, gee, what I really like to do is at halftime in this NBA game, go out and challenge one of the other players to one-on-one. And then I simulate getting crushed or, in truth, not even being allowed out on the court as they shove me back in the stands and being embarrassed in front of my friends. And so I don't do it. And I don't do it even if I might really want to do it because I know what the consequence is going to be. Well, other animals don't have that advantage. They can't simulate it, imagine the shame or embarrassment that they'll feel, and so they'll engage in these behaviors, which could be very costly to their position in the group. So this is a big advantage that we've gained with this huge brain of ours, is our capacity to simulate that. Now, of course, you might say, well, that doesn't feel like an advantage. Being embarrassed is aversive. Feeling ashamed is aversive. That's true. But the fact that you can feel it prevents you from doing those things so many times that it actually benefits you in the long run because you end up suffering a lot less than you would otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting as far as the imagination goes. Now, number 2 is shared thoughts and emotions. And this sort of just reminds me of people wanting to hang out with other folks that are like them, right? Like we just sort of have this inherent pull to want to hang out with people that are like us and have the same opinions and all that sort of stuff.
Well, we do. We have a fundamental pull to try to be with people who share our feelings, and that's definitely true. But we also have a fundamental pull to try to share our feelings of those we're with, and so we seek for what's called the sense of shared reality. And the evolutionary reasons for it are very good. For our groups to be effective on the savannah, they all have to agree what's a threat and what's an opportunity, and they have to orient toward dealing with those things as threats and opportunities. And if no one in the group can agree, well, then the group is no better than a collection of individuals. But if the group can agree on what threats and opportunities are, and better yet, can agree on the best way to get to neutralize threats and to gain those opportunities, well, then the group can become super effective. And so humans are the only animal on the planet that's evolved a fundamental desire to know what each other are thinking. We constantly want to know what other people in our lives think, and we want to share our thoughts with them. And so an easy example to think of is when you're partnered up with somebody and you work elsewhere from each other, you come home at the end of the day, it's super common, well, tell me about your day. And so what did you do? And how did that go? At one hand, that's a totally trivial activity. Why do you care so much about each other's day while you're apart? But on the other hand, it's actually reestablishing a sense of shared reality, a reconnection that lets you know what are the threats and opportunities that they faced and allowing you to come on the same page. And so long as we can do that, so long as we can agree and get on the same page in the end, it's a strong bonding process. Now, if we fail to do that, if they see something emotionally one way and we see it as another way, well, we've evolved to find that threatening. And neither side likes that. And so if over the long term, two people can't see the world in the same way, they tend to go their separate directions. In the same way, over the long term, if two groups can't see things the same way, they tend to split apart. And of course, you see that all over the world, but politics right now is a really good example of that, where particularly in the U.S., these political tribes are at each other's throat all the time because they just fundamentally don't see the world in the same way.
Yeah, that's so true. Now, how does assumption play into that? Because I find myself assuming a lot of, say, what other people are thinking or what their intentions were and all that sort of stuff, where I could just ask, but for some reason I choose not to, and I assume. Like, is there something going on from an evolutionary perspective around assumption?
Well, we're actually really good assumers. It introduces error, of course, but humans are really good at what we call theory of mind, or reading other people's minds, reading their intentions from their behaviors. Other animals don't do this so well. Chimpanzees can do it a tiny bit, but we do it superbly well. And so what we don't realize, we're so good at that we make assumptions all the time. Now, sometimes we know we're making assumptions. We say, that statement that person made was ambiguous. And now often the person who made the statement wanted it to be ambiguous. They're trying to ask you out on a date, but they don't want to be crystal clear in case you reject them, so that they can still have their honor intact, or their pride intact. And so we introduce ambiguity sometimes on purpose. And when we do that, then other people often feel like, I'm assuming X, well, let me run with that. Now, on the one hand, you think, well, we could just check our assumptions all the time, but in truth, we can't. People find that pretty tedious if you're constantly asking them, what did you mean by X? And so in the end, we're actually forced to rely on our assumptions constantly, we can kind of test them gently by, I think she's asking me out on a date. Let me see if I can go down that pathway, but without being too clear myself, and see if we agree on something or whether I'm just misunderstanding her. And so you can, again, because language is complicated, you can use it in ways that are somewhat ambiguous but suggestive to see if things are progressing the way you think they are or if they're not. And of course, some people are much better at this than others. They tend to pick up these cues much better than other people do.
Now, how does exaggeration play in there? Because you mentioned earlier about a sign of quality being a good storyteller, and comedians are some of the best storytellers in the world, but they obviously exaggerate a lot, and it makes the stories much more interesting. So how does exaggeration play in there?
Well, the key for exaggeration is that it allows us to make sure that the people who are telling the story and listen to the story share the same emotion. And so if I tell you a story that's a tiny bit disgusting, you might go, oh, that's no big deal. And I'm kind of disgusted because for me it's kind of gross. And now we don't feel the same. And then there's not that bond. And so I can solve that problem by making it more disgusting, by exaggerating. And so rather than seeing dog poop on the sidewalk, I slipped and fell on it, or it got on my clothes, or now we're all in total agreement that it's disgusting. And so what comedians do is, by exaggerating, they guarantee that their audience feels the exact same way that they do. And then we can make sure that things that are funny by virtue of their outrageousness or their violation of expectations or whatever, we can make sure that they're truly violations because they're not so subtle that we don't get it. And we can make sure they're truly outrageous, etc. And so exaggeration is a strategy we all use, and we all do it whenever we want to make sure that somebody feels the same way about something as we do. So if my boss slightly snubbed me and I'm not even totally sure that maybe she didn't even notice me, so I'm not totally sure it's a snub, but it made me feel bad. Well, now I need to turn up the volume a little bit so I can make sure that everybody else sees it as a snub like I do. So rather than saying I walked by her and said hello and I'm not sure she heard me, I say I walked by her, said hello, she looked at me and didn't even answer. And that now becomes more clearly a snub. It's an exaggeration. It didn't happen, but it allows me to make sure you go, oh, that's terrible. And now we feel the same way. And so comedians do it to make their stories more entertaining and to strengthen the emotion that we all feel, to make sure it's all the same. But in truth, we all do it all the time.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, how about compulsive liars? Because I've come across a couple compulsive liars in my life, and I just find it bizarre because eventually I feel like the people are going to find out, right? And then they put their pattern recognition skills on and sort of notice the next time and the next time and the next time that these people just seem to be lying and their stories aren't adding up. So what would be the evolutionary pull to just straight up lie?
Yeah, it's a bad strategy that some people nonetheless adopt. As you point out, it's pretty rare for people to do it constantly. We all lie a little bit, but it's pretty rare for someone to do it constantly. And I suspect that what they're doing is that they're inept at exaggerating in ways that ensure a shared reality without actually violating the fundamental truth of the story. And so let's take for example, I don't know if you remember when Trump was first running for president, he talked about having seen videos of Muslims dancing in the street after 9/11. Well, those videos don't exist, so we know it's a lie. But the question then becomes, well, if he'd been a little bit more skilled, how could he have communicated the same thing to his followers, but not as a liar? And I think what he could have done is very simple, which is say, I know lots of people were happy about it. They were too clever to display their happiness out there in the world where we could see them. But I know that behind closed doors, these people were celebrating America's cost. And so if he had not just out and out lied by claiming to have seen videos that don't exist, I think that he could have exaggerated much more subtly, and then people would believe him. So you take somebody like that who lies repeatedly, and you could say, well, other people are doing the same thing, but much more socially successful by making sure that the stories that they tell have the same quality, but don't actually have the verifiable aspect of that can be found to be not true.
Gotcha. That's a cool distinction. Yeah, it's funny because it seems like the more and more I look at myself recalling stories or things that happened, you talked about the example with your boss, it's almost like we're just constantly trying to persuade people of 24/7 of sort of our experience.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to persuade them that the experience we had was meaningful and that the meaning was the one I interpreted it to have. And, life is a story of persuasion. If you're the biggest, strongest, smartest, richest, meanest, whatever in the group, you can force people to do what you want. But most of us can't. And so what that means is that to be a success in the world, you have to plant your ideas in other people's heads. And if you can do that, that is, if you can persuade them of your view of the world, well, you're guaranteed to be a success because now they're on your side and they're trying to make the world go the way you want it to go. And so we've all evolved to be these persuasion machines. And some of us are really good at it. We're really subtle and we can communicate things that seem really true. Others are not so good and they come across as exaggerating. And then others, of course, are completely hopeless. They're identified as serial liars and they end up having very little influence.
So number 3 is activities and experiences over material things. I love that. And it sort of brings up the idea of comparison. And you gave an example when I watched your talk around a hedonic treadmill that we're just sort of constantly running on. So can you explain that a little bit for us?
Sure. So it turns out there's a really lovely research by Van Boven and Gilovich, and they showed that they asked people what they spent their money on, whether it was an experience or an object that they just wanted to own. And it turns out that buying things to own doesn't make you happy in the long term. Pretty soon it becomes the new normal. It's the example, the car you gave. If you just want to buy a car to have a nice car and admire it and have everybody go, wow, what a nice car, pretty soon it doesn't make you happy anymore. You adapt to it. But you can take that exact same thing. Imagine that you bought that car because you love to drive quickly through the winding mountain roads where you live. Every time you get in your car and do that drive, you're going to be happy. That experience is going to make you happy. And so it turns out that experiential purposes make us happier than material purposes. It also turns out that holds even when the experiential purpose is really a temporary one. And so the example that I remember being quite surprised in my own life is I always felt that buying fancy vacations is so indulgent. Like, it just seems like what a waste of money. In 2 weeks, it's going to be over. And so when I was in grad school and totally broke, some of my old friends talked me into going to Aspen with them on a ski vacation. Well, I had saved up enough money to do that, but I'd been planning to use that money to buy a new couch because literally the only couch I owned, I had rescued from the side of the street. And it was a disgusting object that Lord only knows what lived inside it. And so, my friends talked me into it. I went to Aspen. I was feeling really guilty even as I went to the airport, like maybe I ought to have a new couch. But in truth, I still think back on that trip to Aspen and how much fun we have, and it still makes me happy now, 30 years later, whereas that couch, well, it's a guarantee that if I bought it, first of all, my wife would have got rid of it when she met me, but second of all, it would be long gone. And so the reason for this is, again, it's this notion that we end up, a lot of times we buy objects in order to get in the status competition with others. And the problem is that you can't win those status competitions because the whole country on average tends to get rich together at the same time. And so if you look at our lives now, if I look at my flat screen TV and the fancy things that I have in my existence, compared to when I was a little kid and I had this cruddy black and white TV that barely worked, well, I ought to be a ton happier. But in fact, the data show that people aren't. That as a country gets richer, it doesn't get happier, even though people are buying nicer stuff. And what that tells you is that what people really want to have is not nicer stuff. They want to have nicer stuff than everybody else. Because it's only possible when you're rich in a country that's not as rich as you are, you do tend to be happier. But as you get richer along with everybody else, you don't. And what that tells us is the junk we own doesn't really make us happy. It's really status that we're jockeying for. And the only reason status really matters is because of mating. We need to be near the top of our group or at least not near the bottom if we're going to attract a partner.
Right. So it's tricky because the status or resources are a sign of quality in one sense, but then on the back end, they actually don't make us happier. So I feel like it would be easy for us to sort of fall into that trap.
Super easy. And that's why we call it a hedonic treadmill. We just keep thinking, boy, I really love my new TV. And then after a while, you're used to it. I need a bigger TV, or I need a better sound system, or now I need to get a better kitchen or a new car. And so our ancestors, I don't think, would have been on this hedonic treadmill, because if I have the best arrows in the group, so to speak, I'm the best arrow maker. Well, I'm in a very small group and I'll probably always be the best arrow maker. But I promise you, no matter how fancy my car is, when I drive down the street, I'm going to see a fancier one. And that's just going to make me unhappy to the degree that I decide that I'm going to jockey for status by the things that I own. And so it's not easy because we evolved to do this. But if you can try not to jockey for status by the things you own, if you can try to spend your money on having great experiences with your friends, those will continue to make you happy, once you've met your basic needs, of course. And And those experiences also, they accumulate in somebody, and they give you a sense of status as well. Like, boy, I've had this really fun life. I've got great friends. We've done lots of wonderful things together. They don't even need to be expensive things, just things that we've enjoyed each other's time together. So it's not easy, because we've evolved to try to get into the mating game, men in particular, by gathering resources. But it is the case that you can, if you remind yourself of that fact, you can put it aside and try to focus on the things that actually do make people happier over the long term.
So do you have any recommendations around people using social media then? Because it is sort of just this constant comparing game of people's highlight reels and stuff like that. Man,
it's bad.
That's tough.
Yeah, it's really bad. I mean, the thing is, we just did not live in a world that people could curate. And so in my ancestral past, you lived in the hut next to me, and I heard you when you had that horrible case of diarrhea, and there you were, suffering, and I knew it. I knew it was happening, and you were not able to put on your best face to me. And the next day when you came out looking better and cleaned up, well, I'm happy that you're looking better and cleaned up, but I know who you are, and I know the bad things that happened to you. And now we live in a world where all you can put up is this one perfect vacation, or the photo that you took from just the right angle, or that lunch that you had, or whatever, and it just makes your life seem so much better than it really is, which is fine, except for the fact that it makes mine seem bad by comparison. Because unfortunately, this status jockeying, the way it works is that we look at others around us to see if we're performing better or worse than they are. And we feel happy when we think we're doing better, and we feel sad when we think we're doing worse. And what social media allows everyone to do is just put up the few best bits and bobs of their life, and then you can say, uh-oh, my life isn't as good as that. I was on the toilet all morning with terrible diarrhea, or whatever the heck it was you were doing. And so it's really hard to escape that cycle. And I have to admit, I don't know a solution to that. I know that social media, it makes people happy if they consume it in small doses and they use it to supplement their ongoing social relationships. I know that it also makes them unhappy if they do it in large doses and they use it to replace their ongoing social relationships. And so it would be nice if the creators of social media could find a way to short circuit our tendency to put up just our best moments. But I don't know of a way to do that everybody would agree to, right? That we wouldn't then try to game as well, because it's human nature to try to game every situation to take advantage of it and make ourselves look a little bit better.
Yeah, and ironically, all of the big companies that run these social media platforms understand our evolutionary biology very well, and so they set these things up. The same with the food industry. They set these things up and give us exactly what we want.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, there's a lovely book. An old friend of mine, Adam Alter, has a book called Irresistible, where he goes through exactly that problem of how they've set technology up to be irresistible in a way that regular face-to-face interaction isn't. But even though regular face-to-face interaction actually is better for us and is more fun and has all those positive qualities, they make the technology hard for us to resist.
Absolutely. Now, number 4 is sharing stories. And I'd love to get your input on how learning itself fits in here to the happiness puzzle, because we would have had to have learned and be learning on a constant basis in order to survive in the best way possible, whether it be, that berry doesn't work, it's poisonous, or whatever it is. But how does learning fit into this?
So we're unique in the animal kingdom in the sense that we rely on learning way more than any other animal. Most other animals only learn a little bit across their lifespan, and as a consequence, it's much easier for them to quickly grow to maturity and become a viable adult. We have so much that we need to learn. We're born so empty that it takes us, more than 10 years to become close to a viable adult. During all that time, we need the protection and care of actual adults. And so that the negative side of that is it's so difficult for us to have babies. But the positive side of that is that we can learn to live in any environment on this planet. And so we're much more adaptable than any other species. We occupy every single niche that exists. But we also have another feature that makes us much more adaptable, and that is our incredible communicative abilities. So coupled with our ability to learn is our ability to tell others about things. And that gives us an enormous advantage over every other animal, because every other animal, basically, when they're born, they have to start at ground zero, and everything that they learned when they die dies with them. And so the next generation's starting right back at ground zero and can't can't ever move beyond it. They can't improve themselves. Whereas human beings can ratchet the learning of prior generations and scaffold upon it so that we build up and know more and more with every generation. And you can see that super easily if you look at what school kids learn today. They're learning about Darwin and Copernicus. They're learning about the great geniuses of just a few hundred years ago who knew things that nobody else knew ever before them. And now, a 6-year-old kid knows that. So it's our amazing ability to communicate that allows us to do this. And what that, in our modern world, what that means is that culture and science move incredibly rapidly. In our ancient world, what it meant was that we didn't have writing and we didn't interact with so many different cultures, but we still could take advantage of the learning of others. And so if, let's say, you had just come back from a hunt and you were attacked by a lion, well, you could tell me how you were attacked and you obviously escaped it. So you did something right. And now when I hear your story secondhand, it's incredibly valuable to me because I go, wow, look how bit up Marcus is, but, I just learned this incredibly valuable knowledge that he has, and I didn't get bit at all. And so human beings would have evolved a really strong predilection to enjoy hearing stories because they were so valuable to them. And then, of course, to the degree that they're valuable to us, we value the people who tell the stories, and therefore we would have also really evolved a strong tendency to want to tell stories and to want to be good storytellers as well. And so because as a species, learning is so important to us, to our survival and success, and because we're so good at communicating, storytelling became tightly interweaved with that. And we know today, for example, that when hunter-gatherer groups, the ones that still exist, when they gather around the fires in the evening, they start telling stories. And those stories have a very different quality to the interactions that they share during the day. They're much more important things. They're about how to live your life in those communities. And that in turn suggests that maybe the invention of the control of fire long ago is part of what started to really help us out and allow us to free ourselves up from the day-to-day activities we need to do, give us some time when we're safe from predators because we're near a fire, we're kept warm, and now we could sit around and relax and enjoy and tell stories and share important lessons. And so I suspect that all these things became intertwined with each other and our really strong predilection to enjoy listening to stories and to enjoy telling them as well.
So if we were talking about stories at night and learning experience about life and stuff like that, what were people talking about during the day? I'm curious.
So during the day, they're mostly the social and economic issues of the time. And so what that means if you're a hunter-gatherer is who brought home what food objects, who's having difficult or good relationships with whom. And so it's the kind of thing that you might just call gossip. So, oh, did you see what so-and-so killed? Oh, good, we're all going to eat like kings tonight. Or, oh, so-and-so came out home empty-handed. And that's economy. And then, oh, did you see that so-and-so's now seems to be moving in with so-and-so where they're really flirting together? And so now you know, oh, that looks like they're becoming a couple. And those are important things to know. You need to know about the economy, and you need to know about the sort of different ways that coalitions are forming in your group. But they don't tell you the big picture things. How do you live your life? How do you avoid important risks? And how do you get important opportunities that happen to exist in the culture in which we live?
That's fascinating. Now, we can pass on these stories via language and documenting them and all that sort of stuff, but it also seems like we have this inherent need, or at least want to experience and make our own mistakes. Like nothing quite feels as real as like messing up yourself. Like, you know what I mean? So to what degree does that play in versus somebody just saying, hey, I learned this, don't make this mistake, and us actually following through with that?
Yeah, that's a great example. And so when somebody tells me how they nearly died, I think, ooh, I want to avoid that. But when somebody tells me how, well, that didn't work out so well and I was embarrassed or whatever, I think, maybe I could do better, or I'd like to try that and see. And so when we're going to do something new, we're super keen to see how it went for other people. But just because it went poorly for them doesn't necessarily stop us. We then gather that information, we integrate it into how we perceive our own abilities and proclivities, and then we decide, well, is that going to work out well for me or not? And so I might have a dream of going up Mount Everest. And so everybody who comes down, I read their stories and or blogs or whatever they've done, and I try to make decisions on how I could best do it. Now that's still, maybe it should stop me. Like maybe I'm just not a good enough climber, and in truth I'm not. But let's just say for the sake of argument that I decided to go up anyway. I still gathered as much information as I possibly can, and I've prepared myself as best I can. So I've taken advantage of the stories that people have told me. I just maybe still make a wrong judgment, which of course is human nature, to make mistakes. It'd be very unusual for me to say, well, I'm going up Everest and I'm not going to read anything anyone's ever done because I just want to see what it's like when I get there. Humans tend not to do that. They tend to want to be prepared. And the bigger the challenge, the more they tend to want to be prepared. If it's a little challenge, like, oh, we're all going to go out to such and such rock and hop 20 feet into the ocean, I go, okay, cool, let me just go. I don't want to ruin it by watching it on YouTube first to see what it's like. I want to experience it. But when the challenge gets bigger, we start to become more focused on preparation, even if in the end we make what may or may not be the right judgment about whether we should do it.
That's a great example. And the statement that you made around the fact that we just make mistakes made me think of the fact that it seems like we're less tolerable of that fact that we make mistakes than ever right now, because people may have made a mistake. They may have said something. They may have done something 20 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever, and it's documented on social media, and all of a sudden this person's life gets completely turned upside down. They might get fired. They might, just everything goes to shit. So what are your thoughts on our inability to tolerate mistakes at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the truth of the matter is that we used to live in a world where there was no exact documentation of anything. And so unless I said something very awful in front of a large group of people, there's no evidence that I said it. And now imagine that times have changed. And so what I said 20 years ago wasn't considered awful then, but would be considered awful now. Well, you could come back to me and say, hey, Bill, you said this horrible thing to us 20 years ago. And I go, A, I don't really recall saying it. But B, the version I said, I recall you laughing. And so, because it was all happened in person, we're equally guilty, so to speak. You didn't get on my case at the time for saying it. In fact, you seem to react positively, so you can't really get on my case now. Whereas if you got a video of me speaking to an audience, I say something that at the time was okay, and in our new world is ghastly, well, then I'm in deep trouble. And the truth of the matter is that society has changed in many, many ways for the better since I was a little kid. So the worst slur you could say to somebody on my playground in my elementary school or my junior high or even high school was to call them a negative term for being gay. And that was the worst thing you could say about somebody when I was a kid. I didn't know anybody who was gay, but the reality is I did. I knew lots of people who were gay, but they were certainly not going to tell anyone because their society was so negative about it. And so it's very easy to imagine that somebody would have used one of those slurs, in a conversation with friends or whatever, because in those days that's how everybody talked, and they were just ignorant about what, about the cost of what they were doing and the consequences of it, and they often didn't realize, well, gee, I'm making fun of gay people, and my best friend here is gay, right? So now we live in a world where that would be forever stored in some form of media because they had this conversation, they tweeted it or texted it or whatever to each other, and now it's going to really hurt them later on. And I think, look, I'm a big believer that people learn. We were just talking about that. And so I really hate this kind of cancel culture stuff where if you said something ghastly 20 years ago or even 20 minutes ago, I'm a big believer in you can apologize for it. And so if you did something, I'm not talking actually harming somebody physically, but if you hurt somebody's feelings by saying the wrong thing X amount of time ago and you feel bad and you sincerely apologize, I think that's the past. If you still endorse it, well, fine. You're not canceling somebody for their prior opinions. You're canceling somebody because they refuse to change with the times. And that's a different matter altogether.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because there was a time in the past where, we didn't think that germs existed. And, doctors would go from handling dead bodies, cadavers, to handling babies, and they were wondering why the, infant mortality rate was so high. And so not taking into account the fact that, like you said, we learn is just unrealistic and just unfair, I think.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. And the thing is that I also promise you that as much as we might be tempted to be appalled by somebody's attitudes and behaviors in the past, when people look back on us, I promise you they're going to be appalled by us as well. And just to give one random example, when's the last time you walked by a homeless person without helping them? Well, it's very possible 50 years from now that'll be looked upon as if you used the N-word, or as if you made fun of gay people, or as if you did all sorts of things that we now regard as ghastly, but didn't 50 years ago. And so people who are tempted to cancel somebody out for their what they regard as inappropriate attitudes are forgetting that someday someone's going to regard their attitudes and behaviors inappropriate as well. And so for me, I think that it's super important that when we think about historical figures that we're trying to, should we pull down that statue? well, how do they look in the context of their time? Abraham Lincoln was a hardcore racist by today's world, but he was an out-and-out abolitionist by their times. And if you look at what Frederick Douglass had to say about him at the time, he was ambivalent, but he was fundamentally positive toward him. And I think that the notion that we should then get on his case because he doesn't meet modern standards is a foolish one. And I think that holds across any kind of spectrum. And so I hate to see people who cancel ideas they disagree with. I way rather, and I'm not even sure I said that properly before, what I'd way rather see is not canceling at all, but arguing. If you do things that I don't agree with, if you use terms I don't like, if you attack a group that I'm fond of, I'd way rather see people engage with each other about it and say, well, why do you feel that way? And is there any value in what you're saying or not? And can I convince you of the opposite, rather than just saying, let's deplatform you and refuse to listen to you? Because that's just, as an academic, that fundamentally goes against how we do our business. We need everyone to be able to be comfortable proposing whatever ideas they want. And if we find those ideas obnoxious, or if we think they're wrong, we need to be able to argue with them rather than try to cancel them and pretend they didn't happen or ignore them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it ironically, deplatforming people goes against open communication, free speech, and learning, because we want to look at every side of an issue, no matter how crazy it sounds. Okay, if it's nuts, then we can debunk it and have a civil conversation and get all the ideas out on the table. But deplatforming just seems like not the way to go.
Yeah, it's bad. And so recently there's an example of an academic in Michigan State who they're trying to deplatform because he said that it's an interesting question to investigate if there's genetic differences between different ethnic groups. And it may or may not be an interesting question to me or you, but the fact is that as an academic, it's allowed for that to be an interesting question to him. And the person should be allowed to pursue anything that he wants. We could potentially find that idea offensive or threatening, but it doesn't change the fact that it's literally, it's a scientific question that, like any scientific question, a person should be able to examine. In the end, what I suspect would happen is that people would find good news. Oh, these differences that we were worried that might be there, well, they're not there. But people aren't even allowing themselves, people like him, to look for that kind of news because they find the process itself so threatening. And that's just fundamentally goes against academics. It goes against what we're about, which is this notion that everybody should be able to explore things that interest them, and they have to then be truthful about what they find, right?
Yeah, totally. And it squashes curiosity, which is just a shame.
Yep. And in class, when I go through some very complex data sets of my students and I say, so what could explain this? It might be a domain where, let's say, males are outperforming females. And I know somebody's thinking, well, men are just fundamentally better at that, but they're afraid to say it. And so I always say to them, well, let's explore the possibility that men are fundamentally better. And then we go into the data and see what it shows. Because students are just worried, well, if I even have that idea, I've committed some kind of crime. Well, no. As scientists, we should consider all ideas viable until we can rule them out. And so there's no crime in having an idea. There's a crime in trying to squash it without thinking it through.
I'm curious now, what are, if any, some of the biggest disparities between men and women when it comes to things like interests? You look at STEM subjects as a huge topic right now. What are some of the things that you've seen?
So interest is a great example. We know that on average, so first of all, people often talk about that women are underrepresented in STEM, and that's actually not quite true. Right now, half the PhDs in the United States in STEM disciplines go to women, so they're absolutely equally represented. What is true, though, is that they're underrepresented in some areas of STEM and overrepresented in others. And in fact, you can predict the degree to which they're underrepresented in an area by the degree to which that area relies on mathematics and is focused on objects rather than being focused on other humans. And then the question becomes why. There's lots of arguments about this. The data are changing constantly, so I can't say I know the answer. But what I can say is that the data that we have so far are suggestive that women are choosing STEM disciplines not because of discrimination by people in the discipline, not because they can't do it, but because they're less interested. And the best data I know that show that are the data that when you look at men and women who are really good at math, and you also ask the question, well, are they really good verbally? Well, some people are really good at math and not so good verbally, and some people are really good at math and also really good verbally. If you look at people who are really good at math and not good verbally, they tend to go into the sciences. But if you look at people who are really good at math and really good verbally, they tend not to go into the sciences. And then if you look down inside those groups, you find that, well, who's really good at math and not verbally? That tends to be men. who's really good at math and verbal? That tends to be women. But men and women with those profiles behave exactly the same as each other. So a man and a woman who are really good at math and not good verbally have an equal probability of going into the sciences. A man and a woman who are both really good at math and both really good verbally tend not to go into the sciences. So it happens to be the case that men and women have different ability profiles, and those ability profiles are associated with different interests, different things that they tend to pursue. Because remember, if you're really good at math, you can pursue the sciences whether you're also really good verbally or not. But what's fascinating is that if you are also really good verbally, you tend not to, or at least not the physical sciences. You may be more likely to go into the social sciences or the life sciences. So I think that the differences in STEM, we've got all these programs all over the world to try to encourage more women to go into STEM. I think they're misguided. Now, I don't know. There could be data that come out tomorrow that could show me that I'm wrong. But when I look at the data that we have to date, they suggest that what's happening is that women are pursuing their interests. And you can see that there's country level differences that show that. There's lots of other evidence that shows that. And so trying to get somebody to do something they're not interested in strikes me as a waste of time.
It's so important, brilliantly explained that, by the way, but it's so important to delve into the nuances of some of these stats, because when we hear these blanket stats thrown around and we just think, if we draw conclusions from those blanket stats, they can really lead us astray, because there are much more nuanced aspects of what goes into that stat than the stat leads on to begin with, if you see it on like a headline on, Washington Post or whatever.
Yeah, that's the problem. And so if you look at the rate of female participation in the physical sciences and in computer science and engineering, and often the rates are down 20%, they're very low, like it's heavily male dominated. And you could think, oh, well, that's a sign of prejudice. These computer scientists and physicists and stuff must be being prejudiced against women. But if you actually look back into the early 70s, you see that was their rate of participation in the life sciences. Well, now there's more PhDs going to women in the life sciences out of the States than men. And so now we'd have to say, well, if it's really prejudice, we'd have to believe that somehow women overcame prejudice in the biological sciences in the 1970s and 80s, but can't overcome prejudice in the physical sciences in the 2020s. I find that super implausible, because I promise you that scientists were a lot more sexist in the 1970s and 80s than they are in the 2020s. So I don't think that there's microaggressions or other things are playing a major role in keeping women out of some areas of science. I think it's fundamentally their own interest. Now, again, it's a super complicated issue. There's a ton of data, and so new data come out on this all the time. And you always have to be open to saying, well, I guess I was wrong, because here's some new really compelling data that show the opposite. But when we look at the data now, following from the 1970s till now, what we see is that the level of female participation across all the sciences, the ordering has stayed exactly the same. In 1970, women were more likely to be in the social and life sciences than they were in the physical sciences. And even though that number was, comparing like 7% to 20, and now that number is comparing like 70% to 20. So the ordering hasn't changed. It's just the representation of women across the sciences has gone way up. And the fact that ordering hasn't changed, that the areas that women were least likely to go into 50 years ago are still the areas that they're least likely to go into, just suggest that they're not interested. And the final piece of that puzzle is that if you ask women about their occupational interests, they'll report that they're much more interested in people-oriented jobs. And if you ask men, they'll say they're much more oriented toward object-oriented jobs, things. Now, not everybody, of course, there are overlapping distributions, but that's this incredibly stable difference of opinion. It emerges across millions of people. It even emerges among the most intellectually gifted humans on the planet. So the super duper smarty pants, who are 1 in 10,000, they show the exact same difference, where with the men more interested in objects and things, and women tend to be more interested in people.
You mentioned that we may be misled in this whole thing with the STEM subjects and all that sort of stuff. Do you think that the denial of the fact or potential fact that men and women are just different and have different interests and stuff is playing a part in that? Or what do you think it is?
Well, we don't know for sure why men and women have different interests. There's some evidence that things like intrauterine testosterone might make a difference, but there's obviously lots of evidence about things happening in your daily lives as well. So I remember seeing a lovely study that showed that when little children are in science museums, parents are more likely to explain the issues that the exhibit is trying to show to their sons than they are to their daughters. And mothers are even more likely to do this as well, although fathers show a slightly bigger bias toward their sons than mothers do. What we don't know is, well, are they doing that because their sons have shown a stronger interest in understanding that than their daughters do? So, parenting is a two-way street. And we often forget that kids have a huge influence on what we do with them because they have preferences too. And so then the question becomes, well, how early do these preferences get shown? Are they being shaped by society and parents? The data suggests they're probably not. We have far fewer STEM graduates in highly gender equal societies like Scandinavian societies than we have in highly gender unequal societies like some in the Middle East and elsewhere in South Asia, where we have lots of gender inequality, but women are far more likely to go into STEM fields there than they are in Scandinavia. And so there's, when we look for evidence that women are being pushed into certain fields or pushed to like certain things, sometimes we see it, but often we don't. And I'd say by and large, it's harder to push people's interests around than you might think.
I think that potentially the distinction between equal opportunity and opportunity of outcome, or what's that distinction?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Opportunity, an opportunity to pursue something, and then an equality of outcome are two very different things. You want equal opportunity to pursue anything. You would never want to have a society or an institution that said, well, members of Group X can't do this or have fewer chances to do this than members of Group Y. But just because that you don't get equality of outcome doesn't mean you don't have equality of opportunity. And so the fact that we have far fewer women programmers and far fewer women, electrical engineers and things like that doesn't mean that they don't have equal opportunity to do it. They may have equal opportunity and just be choosing not to. We have far more men in prison than we have women. We have far more men, in boxers than women, et cetera. Does that mean that women don't have the same opportunity to go to prison that men do? That they don't have the same opportunity to become fighters that men do? Well, no, they typically are less inclined to engage in the activities that get you in prison or that make you become a boxer.
Fascinating. Now, let's get back to number 5 here. So you talk about good long-term relationships. So the first question that pops up for me around that is, are we inherently monogamous?
Well, that's a great question. We do know that monogamy exists in every human culture, but we also know that there's a little bit of sneaking around in every human culture as well. And people who can, through whatever means, have more than one partner often do. And so what I would say is that that the data suggests that humans are basically monogamous, but with a little bit of noodling around on the edges that either manifests itself in the form of sneaking around and having extra partners, or having short-term monogamy, where you are monogamous for a little while and then you become monogamous with somebody else. And when you look across most human societies, basically what you see is a blend of those three things. Some people engaging in long-term monogamous relationships, some people engaging in serial monogamy, and some people engaging in not quite monogamy, sort of a bit of sneaking around. And that seems to be some blend of those is the most common pattern. And what that suggests is that on the one hand, yes, we benefit a lot from monogamy, but on the other hand, it's not easy to maintain a perfectly monogamous relationship.
Yeah. Now, how does opportunity play into that? Because, for example, if you take a very good-looking male, let's say a model male, is he more likely to not be in a monogamous relationship because chances are he has more opportunity to go out and experience more women, in a sense? Or do you know what the research says on that?
Yeah, the opportunity is everything. And so we can kind of laugh at like these famous celebrities who keep divorcing many, many times and think, oh, they're not as stable as I am. But the data suggests if we were famous celebrities, we would do the exact same thing. And so when you look at, for example, people who live in rural versus urban areas, if you live in a rural area, you're much more likely to stay in a monogamous relationship because there's far fewer other people that you could start a relationship with. Whereas if you're in a big city, everyone who walks by is, wow, there's a new opportunity. Maybe my current relationship isn't so good after all. And so the upshot of that is that we know that when we put random people in situations where they have more opportunity, they become less interested in their monogamous partners. And so what that suggests is that if we were models or super duper rich or whatever the things are that the opposite sex likes, we would find ourselves engaging in a lot more short-term uncommitted relationships simply because we could. because human beings evolved to take those opportunities when they presented themselves, largely because they didn't present themselves that often. A strategy of indiscriminate mating wasn't very available to almost anybody in the past because there simply weren't that many people in their group. And as a consequence, the safest, best strategy tends to be monogamy. Pair up with somebody, stick with them, help them raise the kids. That gets your children to reproductive age and it passes on your tendencies. But now we live in a world where literally if I'm, Brad Pitt, I don't ever have to marry anybody, and I could have a gazillion kids if I want to, a gazillion relationships. We didn't evolve to want to have kids. We evolved to want to have sexual relationships, and then, of course, kids inevitably followed in our past. So I can enact that world. I can live that world if I want to, if I'm sufficiently good-looking or famous or rich. And the data suggests that when people are, that's pretty much what they do. Not all of them, of course, but most of them.
That's a really interesting distinction that you made around us having an inherent want or need to have sex, but not necessarily have kids, because some people have it, or I've talked to people that have it in their minds that they, were born to be a mother or born to be a father, and they've always wanted to be a parent. So you're saying that it's actually the drive for us to want to have sex and experience pleasure, not actually have children.
Well, I would say two things. There's individual differences in how much we want to have sex, but most people have a very strong desire to have sex. And then there's individual differences in how nurturant people feel. And so when you look around and see other people raising their kids, if you're really nurturing people and you love children, that's going to manifest themselves in, I have a strong desire to have children. Our ancestors, though, if you go back far enough, they had no idea that having sex was even correlated with having children, right? Because it's not a very strong correlation. That happens way later in time. And so you get lots of early societies that have completely mistaken theories about how that works. So we know that we didn't evolve to have a desire to have kids. We evolved to have a desire to have sex that almost all humans share. And then we evolved a tendency to feel nurturant to those little babies that came along as a consequence. Now, females probably evolved to feel more nurturant than males because the bond was more important for them. And we also know that nursing itself and birth will both release oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical. I know in the case when my son was born, it took me literally months to feel bonded to him. I cognitively knew I loved him the moment he came out, but I didn't feel it. Whereas my wife felt it very, very quickly. And that's that pregnancy and lactation, which releases oxytocin and creates that strong mammalian bond system that just took me as a father a lot longer. Now, once that system started to work with my second child, it went faster, but it's still the same thing. And so there's a real separation. I could be a very non-nurturing person. I could dislike kids, but the way that we evolved is once I have my own, I'm going to bond to it just by virtue of constant skin-to-skin contact, if I'm a woman, by nursing, etc. So evolution solved that problem, even though there's big individual differences in what we now decide to do, because, of course, we have birth control and we can completely separate sex from how many children you have.
Right. Yeah, I remember having it explained to me in sort of a funny way as far as the difference between men and women around sex and things like violence. So, for example, any man can walk into a bar, this person said to me, any man can walk into a bar and get in a fight relatively easily, and any woman can walk into a bar and have sex relatively easily, but if you reverse those roles, it's actually much harder. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great way of explaining it. And so another way of thinking about it is how many wait staff, people who wait tables or bars end up going home and sleeping with celebrities. Well, if they're guys, it probably happens really rarely. But if they're women and they're highly attractive, it probably happens quite often. And so if you ask yourself, what's your chance of sleeping with a celebrity? If you're a guy and you're going to sleep with a celebrity, you've got to be a big deal yourself because you're trading something off. But if you're a woman, her interest in having sex is going to be 99% of the variance, right? And so, and again, this comes back to a theory that Trivers proposed back in the early 70s about parental investment. Because women put so much energy into creating an offspring, they're super selective about who they have sex with because it's so much of an investment that they're making. Whereas for guys, literally the minimum investment to have a kid is a teaspoon of sperm that they basically were going to make anyway. And so their investment can be so minimal that their standards tend to be much, much lower. Whereas, as you point out, men are much more competitive with each other. And of course, that comes around large part of that is competing for access to women, that it's easy for men to get into a fight, whereas women tend not to fight. And a woman who wanted to get in a fight with another woman, most women would be like, what do you want about? I don't have no interest in that.
How do you think that birth control plays into that then? Because taking birth control makes it highly unlikely that you will get pregnant, and therefore women can have sex with less repercussions. So how do you think that, is there an evolutionary mismatch there, or what's going on?
Yeah, part of it is a mismatch, so that women had to worry so much about who they had sex with in the past that even if it looked like fun, they thought, I'm not sure that guy has genes that I want in my family line if I'm going to put that much effort into it, or I'm not sure that guy's going to help me. Either of those things would get him to stop. And now they could say, well, I'm not going to have a kid with them, let's do it. But they still have to overcome this basic underlying evolved predilection to be much more choosy. And so you do have some women who are very non-choosy, some women who are quite happy to have sex with most anybody, but way more men feel that way. And one example of that is you can look at Tinder, and you can look at what's the chance that men and women are swiped right. And what you see is that very few men get swiped right by almost everybody, and then lots and lots of men are not swiped by almost anybody at all. Among women, it's shared much more equally. Men are far more likely to swipe right in general, and so what that means is that when women are on Tinder, there's almost always somebody swiping right on them. So you have this sort of system whereby female preferences are highly unequal. And if this were a country, all the wealth would go to a very small percentage of individuals, and all the female interest is going to a very small percentage of men, whereas the male interest is shared much more broadly among the women because, again, this notion of inherited pickiness or choosiness.
Basically, there's a small percentage of men that are having sex with a far larger percentage of women, and then a lot of men that are just out of the sexual pool in a sense completely.
Yes, and this is this notion of incels, right? And so if you sign up for Tinder and you're a really good-looking guy, or you're sitting in your Ferrari, I'm not on Tinder. This came out long after I was married, so I don't quite know what the pictures tend to look like. But if you do that, if you signal that you're highly valuable, you get lots of women who are interested. If you don't have those signals, you don't. And in contrast, women tend to get men interested in them. And so if people use Tinder for different things, but if you're using it for sexual relations, you can already see that women are still being choosier than men, even in a world where that's what they're potentially looking for, and even in a world where they know they won't necessarily get pregnant because they're just simply not choosing most of the guys.
That is absolutely fascinating and makes complete sense. Now, Bill, I could talk to you forever. Where can folks find the Social Leap, your social handles, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm not super active on social media, but people can find me. The book is available anywhere. It's both audio and physical copy and e-copy, and that's Amazon or any bookstore. As far as finding me, the best place is just Googling me on the web. And so there's podcasts like yours. There's my homepage where my research is and stuff like that. And of course, people are more than welcome to get in touch with me. And my email and all that is equally easy to find on the web. So I'm not really on Twitter. I have an account, but I don't tweet very much. I mostly just follow people to learn information. So I'm not very good on social media, but on the old-fashioned stuff and on the research side, I'm very easily found.
Amazing. I will link to all that stuff in the show notes, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights with us. It's just so interesting.
Totally my pleasure. Great talking to you, Marcus.
I hope you guys enjoyed that episode with Bill von Hippel. If you think that someone that you know might enjoy the information in this episode too, please feel free to share it around. I'd really appreciate it. It helps the podcast grow, and that way we can reach more folks with this information. If you're interested in personalized nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching, or just click the link in the show notes below. Also, follow me on Instagram at N1Fitness and friend me up on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.